She was known as the Speed Queen of the Lakes, a steamer renowned for delighting passengers with her rapid, record-breaking pace. But on the morning of July 24, 1915, the famous SS Eastland lay sprawled on her side in the Chicago River. At around 7:30 a.m., minutes into her journey and only meters from the shore, she rolled in 20 feet of water, critically overbalanced by the 2,500 passengers and crew aboard. For the thousands of people watching on from Chicago's Clark Street Bridge dock, the worst disaster in the history of the Great Lakes now unfolded before their eyes. Victims not killed instantly or trapped below decks fought to survive amid a throng of bodies in the water, grabbing one another and pulling each other down. Onlookers mostly remembered the screaming that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. 844 died in the carnage, including 22 families completely wiped out. But how could any of this have happened? How could a vessel carrying 2,500 passengers just capsize like that, and so close to the dock? And how could so many people lose their lives just a few yards from safety? Hey, I'm Andy Roberts, and this is the story of ignored warnings, of ambition and overestimation, of bizarre paradoxes and real human tragedy. This is the story of the SS Eastland disaster. It was supposed to be a pleasure cruise, a summer's picnicking jaunt for the employers of the Western Electric Company. Eager for some respite from the grueling 6-day weeks at the company's Hawthorne Works in nearby Cicero, 7,000 people had bought tickets for the excursion. 5 ships had been chartered for the journey, and the first to leave would be the SS Eastland. But as people began to gather on the Clark Street Bridge dock a little before 6:30 a.m. on July 24, 1915, the mood may have been somewhat subdued. Rainy, gloomy weather dampened the spirit. The earliness of the hour dulled the senses. Still, at least they weren't at work, and soon they'd be on their way, racing across Lake Michigan on board the fastest ship on all the Great Lakes. Their destination was the funfair and picnic grounds of Washington Park in Michigan City, Indiana. A short hop of about 40 miles. It shouldn't take much more than a couple of hours once the so-called Speed Queen hit full steam. The call to board came at 6:30. Just 11 minutes later, it was already clear that something was wrong. The Eastland began to roll, first to starboard, then to port, as passengers fanned out across her deck. It took 40 minutes for the ship to reach capacity. 2,500 crowded aboard as the crew fought to keep the 275-foot-long vessel under control. By 7:16 a.m., the gangplank was pulled up and the ship prepared to depart, but the listing still had not been corrected. As the Eastland leaned 15 degrees to port, the crew attempted to fill her starboard ballast tanks, though the alarming angle made this slow and difficult. Sometime between 7:23 and 7:25 a.m., the Eastland began to pull away from the dock. It's believed the several lists to port may have been temporarily corrected around this time, but by 7:27 she was rolling again, leaning at an angle of 25 degrees and counting. By now, the fate of the Eastland and 844 of her passengers and crew was sealed. With water pouring in below, stokers and oilers fled the boiler room in terror, headed for the main deck. On the upper hurricane deck, crew members desperately tried to convince passengers to counteract the roll by moving to starboard. It was too little, too late. There was no dramatic plunge into the depths. There was no depth. There was just 20 feet of water and a layer of mud beneath. As the Eastland rolled steadily onto her side, there was only enough water to partially submerge her. But for those on board, it was a chaotic nightmare that many would not escape. The grim weather of the July morning had sent many passengers below decks. The Eastland was equipped with 4 decks altogether: the top deck or hurricane deck, the promenade deck just below, the spar deck, and the lower deck. Passenger RJ Moore remembered how in the minutes leading up to the disaster, the promenade deck was awfully crowded with a lot of children in their mother's arms, and a lot of boys and girls from the age of 8 up to 15. For those people packed into the middle decks, their positioning now meant the difference between life and death. Anyone who had moved over to the starboard side, the side closest to the dock, had a reasonable chance of survival. Those who instead went to port were condemned to almost certain death. When the ship rolled, those on board rolled too, along with all the provisions and equipment stocked on board. This meant hundreds of people, along with crates of food, ice boxes, even pianos, launched from one side of the vessel to the other. Passenger George Goyette, a foreman at the Hawthorne plant, witnessed the chaos. "What I saw was exactly what you see when you watch a lot of children rolling down the side of a hill," he said. "The entire crowd of men, women and children came slipping and sliding and sprawling down, with a mass of lunch boxes, milk bottles, chairs, rubbish of every sort on top of them. Anyone caught beneath the lethal flood of bodies and debris basically had no chance. They were either crushed to death or suffocated beneath the weight now on top of them." The coroner's report confirmed how devastating this roll was. Many of the dead were found not to have drowned, but were instead killed by impact and asphyxiation as bodies piled up on top of them. The port sides of the two middle decks were essentially death traps, the most lethal areas on the Eastland. Those on the upper deck were not crushed or buried by bodies, but survival was far from guaranteed here either. Many were pitched directly into the water and pinned down there by the carpet of people on the surface. Watching from the dock, Western Electric nurse Helena Repper remembered seeing people struggling in the Chicago River, clustered so thickly that they literally covered the surface. A few were swimming, the rest were floundering about, some clinging to a little raft that had floated free, others clutching at anything they could reach, Repper said. They clutched at bits of wood at each other, grabbing each other, pulling each other down and screaming. The screaming was the most horrible of all. The Eastland went down only 19 feet from the dock, and so the rescue began almost immediately. Stricken passengers were pulled from the water in their dozens, receiving medical attention on the quayside. Many cared for by Western Electric nurses like Helena Repper herself, who had been waiting to board their own boats. As half of the Eastland still lay above the waterline, many were able to scramble onto the ship's upturned hull. Shocked by what they had experienced, they stepped from the stricken vessel onto the tugboat Kenosha, which served as a bridge between the ship and the safety of the dock. Rescuers quickly moved in the opposite direction, crossing the Kenosha and leaping aboard the Eastland. With so many still alive in the belly of the ship, time was of the essence, and rescuers began cutting through the hull with blowtorches in an effort to rescue some of those still trapped below. Deep inside the ship, some crew members kept on working. Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson fought to control and cool the ship's boilers, averting an explosion that would surely have claimed even more lives. He would not leave his post until the water reached his neck, scurrying out of his vessel through an air duct. Around 2/3 of the passengers and crew were rescued, but this left 844 who died in the tragedy. The dead were so numerous that the city of Chicago commissioned a giant net to prevent bodies floating out into Lake Michigan. Police divers tasked with bringing up the remains reportedly broke down, frustrated by the sickening loss of life. With nowhere to put the bodies, a temporary morgue was set up on Chicago's 2nd Regiment Armory. Anxious family members queued outside, awaiting the somber task of identifying their loved ones. As the last devastated family member left the building, one body remained unidentified, that of a young boy. Known as the little fella by local police, the body was eventually identified by neighbors. He was Willie Novotny, age 7. His parents and 10-year-old sister had all died with him on the Eastland. They were buried together at the Bohemian National Cemetery, Cook County, Illinois. Willie was far from the only child to perish on the Eastland. Of the 844 victims, 286 were under the age of 18. Around 590 were under the age of 25, and the average age of the fatalities was only 23. What was supposed to be a pleasure cruise had turned into a disaster that snuffed out lives indiscriminately and destroyed entire families like the Novotnys in a matter of minutes. How could this have been allowed to happen? How could a pleasure cruise turn into a mass tragedy just 19 feet from the dock? Well, right from the beginning, the SS Eastland had a troubled history. She'd made her maiden voyage on July 16, 1903, sailing from Port Huron to Mechanic Island, then to Manistee and South Haven, Michigan. Before that first month was out, she'd had her first accident, a collision with the tugboat George W. Gardner. Just a month later, in August 1903, the Eastland experienced trouble of a different kind. After failing to receive their promised potato rations, her firemen mutinied. 6 men were arrested and the ship's captain, John Peru, was relieved of his duty. Those early issues might have been considered teething troubles for a craft still not a year old, but problems kept on coming for the Eastland. She had a deep draft, which basically meant she sat low in the water. This made her nice and stable, but made entering South Haven Harbor difficult. So when the ship was temporarily taken out of service in September 1903 to be fitted with a McCreary air conditioning system, the ship's owner took this opportunity to reduce her draft. By May 1904, the Eastland was back out on the lakes. The air conditioning system made her heavier, but now she sat high in the water. This greatly increased her speed. In a new century with new technologies and an anything is possible attitude, speed was a big deal. The Wright brothers had achieved powered flight at Kitty Hawk only 6 months earlier, while Henry Ford had broken the 90-mile-per-hour barrier for the first time in his Ford 999 motor car that January. Such public fascination with speed and engineering prowess gave the Michigan Steamship Company an idea. They started putting the word about that their Eastland was the fastest craft on the Great Lakes. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go down too well with the owner of rival ship, the City of South Haven. They too claimed their own boat as the fastest on the Great Lakes. There was only one way to settle this: a race. Big claims were made, wagers were placed, and the public eagerly anticipated the results of this clash of the great steamers. In the end, the Eastland won with ease, clocking up 22 miles per hour between South Haven and Chicago. The title Speed Queen of the Lakes was hers. So the Michigan Steamship Company had their accolade, but where was all this ambition taking them? And more importantly, where was it taking their passengers? In July 1904, only 2 months after the race, the Eastland came close to disaster for the first time. The reduced draft made her fast, but it also made her dangerously unstable. Leaving South Haven that summer, a crowd of some 1,200 people congregated on her upper hurricane deck, eager to experience the thrill of tearing across Lake Michigan. Unable to cope with so many people in one part of the ship, the Eastland began to roll, leaning almost 15 degrees to port before the crew brought it under control. But the crew had miscalculated. They overcompensated, sent the craft lurching the other way, to starboard. It's believed she leaned as far as 25 degrees before being righted again. It was a lucky escape, made even luckier when you consider how many people were on board. You see, it wasn't just the draft that had changed. With her new layout, the ship's capacity was increased to 3,300. Around 3,000 people were tossed from side to side as the Eastland floundered outside South Haven. If she'd gone over fully that day in July 1904, 5 miles out onto the lake, the loss of life would have been enormous. So why weren't these early warnings taken seriously? Well, to be fair on the ship's owners, they did comply with recommendations made after the near catastrophe off South Haven. They reduced the ship's maximum capacity, although only to 2,800. But even at this reduced capacity, the Eastland was still desperately unstable. In August 1906, with 2,530 people on board, uneven passenger distribution led to another roll and another barely averted catastrophe. Despite another near disaster, no moves were made to reduce her capacity further. Between 1907 and 1909, she was sold twice, first to the Lakeshore Navigation Company, then to Eastland Navigation Company, both operating out of Cleveland, Ohio. Eastland Navigation Company made some effort to reduce her weight. 39 cabins were removed, and in 1912 her funnels were shortened, but this didn't make her any safer. Her capacity remained the same, and still she rode high in the water. There was an air of complacency about the whole thing. The Eastland had come close to disaster before, and her crew had literally steadied the ship. Why shouldn't they be able to do it again? But there was greed too. The company wanted that ticket money, so they needed a high passenger capacity, and they needed high speeds to keep the punters flowing in. It simply would not do for the Eastland to lose her lucrative reputation. The Speed Queen must live on. Even after another near miss in 1912, a roll while boarding passengers at Cleveland, Ohio, that nearly sent the ship under, the urge to be the best, to be the fastest, and to make the most money spurred the ship's owners on. Unbridled ambition was driving the Eastland closer and closer to disaster, but what happened next is perhaps the biggest paradox of the story. A move to make the Eastland safer perhaps ended up increasing the risk of catastrophe. In April 1912, the RMS Titanic went down in the Atlantic, taking more than 1,500 lives with her. The public outcry in the US was immense, and there was real pressure on the government to make sure such a thing could never happen again. In 1915, the Seamen's Act was passed. There were many provisions attached to the act, but the one most relevant to the Eastland was this: all ships must carry enough lifeboats to allow for a full evacuation. Surely this was a good thing. The Eastland had flirted with disaster before, but at least now she would have enough lifeboats to carry people to safety. Not everyone was so sure. A.A. Shantz, general manager of the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company, voiced his concerns at congressional hearings in 1914, stating the new requirements would make the low-draft ships on the Great Lake top-heavy and a severe risk of overbalancing. Meanwhile, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamboat Company had just bought the Eastland and refitted her according to the new requirements. She returned to the Great Lakes on June 14, 1914. 1 year and 10 days later, the Eastland was setting out from the Clark Street Bridge dock in Chicago, laden with passengers excited for the day ahead. And Shantz's grim prediction was about to come true. In terms of passengers alone, more died upon the SS Eastland than on the Titanic 3 years earlier, and the total death toll was more than double that of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And yet both disasters tend to overshadow the Eastland sinking. In some ways, the slow, horrific roll of the Eastland had become Chicago's forgotten tragedy, an event of sickening proportions that is now obscured by more than a century of history. But at the time, this was not the case. An outpouring of public grief led to a collection that raised around $400,000 for the families and victims, and lurid details of the tragedy filled newspapers across the country and beyond. With so much scrutiny, the ship's owners and Western Electric began to fashion their own version of events. It was the passengers who were to blame. The passengers toppled the Eastland by congregating too thickly on her port side. But the federal government had other ideas. Recognizing that boats are supposed to be able to take the weight of their passengers, the government pointed the finger of blame at Captain Harry Peterson, Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson, and 4 officers of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company. They were charged with criminal negligence and incompetence, leading to the deaths of more than 800 people. All 6 defendants were found not guilty in February 1916. But it was clear this had been no unforeseeable accident. More than a decade of rolls and near capsizes had been ignored, and the ship's owners had repeatedly modified and redesigned the ship to be faster and to carry more passengers. While the provisions of the Seamen's Act may have pushed the Eastland over the edge, making her more dangerously unstable than ever before, the ship's seaworthiness had been questionable almost since day one. Another case, a civil one, was opened. This case focused on 2 key possibilities. 1, the Eastland was unseaworthy while she was being used as a passenger ship, and 2, her owners knew about and intentionally ignored the dangers of using the ship. The stakes were high. According to Illinois statutes of the time, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company would need to pay $10,000 for each wrongful death if either possibility was proved true. This would total $9 million, a huge sum in the first half of the 20th century. Progress was slow. Finally, in December 1933, 18 and a half years after the tragedy, the verdict came in. The Eastland had been seaworthy, and company management were not aware of the risks of operating the ship on the lakes. So how did she go down? According to the civil case findings, it was Joseph Erickson's fault, the chief engineer, who had kept working below decks long after the Eastland rolled, was deemed to have improperly operated the ballast tanks and promptly became the scapegoat for the entire disaster. This was convenient for the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company. Erickson had died of heart disease in 1919, and with the wrongdoing all pinned on him, the maximum damages were limited to the scrap value of the Eastland, $46,000. It wasn't even enough to pay off the creditors. The families never saw a penny. As the press authorities and grieving family members tried to understand what had happened, the Eastland lay on her side by the dock. a stark reminder of the tragedy that had just taken place. The Great Lakes Towing Company sent their salvage vessel, the Favorite, to help with the task of removing the Eastland. Funnels, masts, and lifeboats were dismantled, and a system of electric lights was set up, illuminating her carcass where she lay. Finally, on August 14, 1915, the excess water was pumped out of her, and the ship was hoisted upright on cables. Once floated, the Eastland stood at the dock for 3 days as crowds gathered to take one last look at the shattered portholes and mangled hull of the craft before she was towed away. Incredibly, this was not quite the end of the Eastland story. With the US joining the First World War in 1917, she was recommissioned as a gunboat named the Wilmette. Though she saw no active service in the conflict, the Navy kept her on, using her as a training ship over the next 3 decades, including during World War II. On Halloween 1946, more than 30 years after the disaster on the Chicago River, the Wilmette was scrapped, and the Eastland's troubled, tragic journey finally reached its end. The tragedy of the SS Eastland may not be the best known, but it has had a far-reaching legacy in disaster relief. Following public donations in the aftermath, the American Red Cross developed a new way of distributing funds according to the needs of specific families. This method of relief allocation is still used in the 21st century. Beyond this, historians have worked hard to keep the memory of those lost in the tragedy alive. The Eastland Disaster Historical Society provides a wealth of resources, all intended to do exactly that, and their research has proved invaluable to our understanding of what happened and why that day in 1915. In 2015, a group of historians, legal experts, and even a Supreme Court justice staged a mock trial to try to get to the bottom of who was really to blame for the tragic events of July 24th. The president, vice president, and secretary-treasurer of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company were all put back on trial, charged with involuntary manslaughter. 5 of the 6 jurors returned a not guilty verdict. Only 1 voted guilty, saying the ship should have been tested after the lifeboats were added. When the 300 in the audience were asked for their own verdicts, 58% said not guilty. Now, more than a century on from the sinking, none of the survivors are still with us. Many saw out the rest of their lives with the anguish of having lost a loved one on that day. Some lost more than one. Maritime technology has advanced far beyond that of 1915, and there are few lessons still to learn from the tragedy of the Clark Street Bridge dock. Instead, we're left with the forlorn memory of 844 people who set out on a summer excursion one July morning, and who never came home.